Hi, this is Jules, Stephen Analog. I thought I'd do a video exploring the ADHD Myth documentary by Max Pemberton that aired on Channel 4 recently, but more from an angle of understanding why people think that ADHD might be a myth and sort of hopefully counteracting some of those misunderstandings. Just for acknowledge my professional background is as a clinician helping assess managing deaf population and dizzy people. But it's really at its core it's an interface between the body and mind. And I've had training in psychiatry, as well as including CAMS, as well as neurodevelopment. And I've got experience of assessing and managing children and adults with ADHD. I have a background of degree in neuroscience and I actually became interested in ADHD and autism around 2006. And I've also completed accredited training programs by the UK Adult ADHD Network on diagnosis and management, including non-pharmacological strategies as a core component of that. I've also been lead for the Association of Neurodivergent Doctors peer support group, which has given me the privilege of hearing the stories of our members, which are in last count was over around 3,000 people. Ironically, it wasn't actually until I'd completed my training as a specialist consultant that I got a diagnosis of distraction subtype ADHD. Having firmly been in the ADHD as overdiagnosed camp up till that point, it came as a bit of a shock until I started to educate myself further. And it's changed my understanding. There's been such a sea change of opinion and our understanding of the condition over the past decade or so that unless you're keeping up to date, it's really easy to be left behind without data and ideas. And I think that's what the trap that Max Pemberton has fallen into. Rather than focus on solely counteracting the misinformation, for which there's been lots of robust responses already, I wanted to cover it from the different angle of asking why do people think ADHD is a myth, because this is a kind of pushback that we see. Not just with ADHD, but with lots of things in general, as our kind of understanding changes over time. And when you look at it from that perspective, that there's been decades-long attempt to raise awareness of ADHD, as our changing shifted it from being a developmental disorder in childhood to realizing that it affects people throughout the life span. And the unwillingness to acknowledge this has some particularly harrowing implications. My standpoint personally is that valid arguments were put across around how much of ADHD is a social construct and the default rush to use medication. I don't disagree with those. However, these remain true regardless of whether you believe in ADHD as a whole. The misunderstanding ultimately comes down to a change in the way, well, I think it comes down to the way we view diagnoses. And one of the things that wasn't mentioned is that there's been a shift in how the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, most recent version, iteration 5, recommends criteria are applied. It's a subtle but important shift from a categorical trying to put people into boxes to recognizing that there's a lot of overlap and that we should be having a dimensional approach to reflect the reality of these overlapping features between different diagnoses that might be listed. Before I start, I wanted to just emphasize that while it's true there has been a huge surge in awareness and people seeking diagnosis due to multiple factors, what has been known for decades is that there's a fairly consistent prevalence of ADHD worldwide of around 5 to 7% in children and 2.5 to 5% in adults. In other words, there's around 1 in 20 people would be predicted to have ADHD, and that's irrespective of cultural factors. To put this in perspective, the incredulity he stated at the figure of 2.5 million people in the UK being diagnosed highlights, if anything, that we're under-recognising and under-treating ADHD, given that the UK population is around 70 million, and that would put the recorded prevalence at around 1 in 28 or 3.5% of the population. With such a large proportion of people affected, it's entirely accurate to acknowledge there is an element of a social construct in defining where the cutoff for a diagnosis is. This is not something that's different from any other diagnoses or based on features that tend to be based on features of clinical presentation, though. And it's not mutually exclusive with validity of a given diagnosis or really what it comes down to is the difficulties faced by a section of the population, largely down to having to navigate world where the systems are not designed for them. The other thing is that as our understanding has changed over the years, it's become apparent that co-occurrence is the rule rather than the exception. There are higher rates of other common mental health disorders such as bipolar, depression, anxiety disorders, and personality disorders. And to be clear, that's to say people will meet diagnostic criteria for more than one thing at the same time. Additionally, research into brain-body interface highlights that there are multiple organic causes for worsening of ADHD symptoms. So this is where the psychosocial strategies become quite important, and it can be quite challenging to disentangle what is actually going on, as it takes time to observe response to management interventions, including the non-pharmacological strategies. We also know that while stimulant medication is highly effective, it's actually the second most evidenced intervention across psychiatric conditions, far in excess of common antidepressants and antipsychotics that Max Pemberton will have been used to prescribing. We know that stimulants do not address all the symptoms, and that the psychosocial interventions are of equal importance. It's also fully acknowledged that in the right environment and with appropriate support, a significant proportion of people affected by ADHD are able to function without the need for stimulants, and that's reflected in recommendations for best practice. It should be an ongoing discussion with the clinician over meeting specific targets for symptom control and what they want to do. It's not, I don't know any clinician that would go against wanting to try psychosocial interventions off instead of pharmacological intervention, stimulant medication, and I count myself in that. In regards to Max Pemberton, his reaction is, I'd say, to be expected. He undoubtedly has a high IQ, which ends up acting as a protective factor. And he's also been privileged enough to have a life course that has accepted his differences, allowing him to be in a position today where he has this portfolio career. His denial of having ADHD is, if we assume that the assessment was done truthfully, is not an uncommon reaction, particularly when people are not expecting you to sort of raise the diagnosis or the suggestion of diagnosis. It comes down to when you've spent your whole life being different, you don't know any different. So there's a sort of grieving period that is very common, where you are looking back at the life you had and starting to think, well, actually, I didn't need to suffer or struggle so much. What isn't part of the diagnostic criteria, but almost universal in the adult population seeking diagnosis, is this sense of chronic shame that's been built up over many years because of the impact of ADHD symptoms. Being told that you're too much, or making bad impulsive decisions, not acknowledging hierarchy socially. And additionally, masking of symptoms by social conditioning is recognised as presenting a significant burden on cognitive resources. And that's even with medication, which can then manifest as rebound symptoms emerging due to the impact of the cognitive load. But what about the rest of the naysayers featured in the documentary? Surely their fears are founded. The problem here is one of time lag, I think, between emergence of data and transition to clinical practice. And this is something that occurs across the board with medical conditions. This tends to be about 10 to 15 years before research findings shuffled into general usage. Awareness of neurodevelopmental conditions has traditionally only been a small part of general adult psychiatric training, which Max Pemberton would have had. And that's even within CAM services. They have exposure to a neurodivergent population will tend to be skewed by virtue of the diagnostic pathways that they're seeing. Most of the kids will be picked up earlier on, but there's still a significant amount that end up being missed because of masking and stereotypes that then go on to seek diagnosis as an adult. In my own clinical practice, I've had to advocate for many people I've identified via routine screening that I do in my clinics as part of looking for what might be contributing to migraine activity, or more accurately, brain overloading, causing problems with dizziness and derealization. Often they've been labelled with depression, anxiety, or functional neurological disorders, but are considered treatment resistant to standard pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. This isn't an attack on psychiatric colleagues, but rather an acknowledgement that training on manifestations and the complexities of neurodevelopmental conditions needs to be improved. Indeed, like despite having developed an interest some 20 years ago, my current clinical knowledge and understanding has really emerged over the past 5 or 6 years since I had my own diagnosis. So, why ADHD diagnosis isn't a myth? Before jumping to the diagnostic criteria, which most people are doing, it's entirely appropriate to raise fear of diagnostic overshadowing, and it's worth considering what a diagnosis actually is. Certainly, on the training that I've had, there's a heavy emphasis on common conditions that can mimic ADHD and how to look out for them, and how that may change or alter management. I highly recommend the book Medical Modelling Mental Health by psychiatrist Sami Huda, which explores what a diagnosis is in a great amount of detail and what the pitfalls are. But in essence, any given diagnosis we seek evolves through stages of recognition of a pattern of symptoms or signs, and over time, a cluster of these will be then formalized. As recognition increases, the diagnostic criteria are formalized for these syndromes, and then theories and research into causative mechanisms then occur. With ADHD, we're at this stage of the clinical criteria, and we're now starting to develop the research and data to understand the underlying causative mechanisms. What we're increasingly finding through the advent of whole genome genetic testing being available is that multiple underlying causes at a metabolic level can emerge. Indeed, one could argue that ADHD is not a single diagnosis, but rather the end manifestation of multiple factors all interacting with each other. And some of these will be social and environmental. There are hundreds of rare 1 in a million syndromes recognized to have ADHD or autism as manifestations of underlying genetic change. And while individually they're rare, collectively as a whole, they make up a significant portion of the population. And in my own practice, it was not uncommon to seek diagnosis formally of ADHD or autism as a step towards exploring the underlying syndrome that may be there. And it's, in essence, any diagnosis, it really should be seen as a working one that should be reevaluated in response to treatment and emergence of patterns to health over the lifespan. To say that there are no biomarkers for disease is, I'd say, misinformed at best. We know that there is a neurological basis, including differences to dopamine transporters in the brain, causing clearance to be increased. And this manifests as a relative reduction in dopaminergic activity in the brain, causing these behavioral changes, which then respond to stimulant treatment paradoxically. Something that Max Pemberton actually demonstrated in the documentary as a basis for arguing that his short trial of Elvance made him somehow less himself. What I'd say is, as a point of fact, if people are stabilised on the correct dose, this shouldn't be an issue. And certainly many people within creative fields, of which there is a significantly high prevalence of ADHD, as alluded to by the proportion of celebrities with a diagnosis, they do not find that their drive has gone. And when you're starting medication for the first time, it's common to get the sort of side effects where it's too blunting, but the brain sort of adjusts over time. And so for a fair trial, you need to be doing it for a couple of months to really understand how it's affecting performance and symptoms in a really, which can be quite a subtle way. Going back to, if you've never known any different, how do you know what's normal? And that's part of the insight that one gains once one's had a diagnosis by educating yourself. Conversely, it's also known that standard use of antidepressant medication like SRIs can sometimes worsen ADHD symptoms due to mitigation of the arousal state and noradrenergic pathways, which is the physiological compensation for dopamine deficiency. People with ADHD often have developed behaviours of psyching themselves up and reliance on artificial deadlines to motivate them, which the SSRIs can then rob them of. Furthermore, it's also well established that neurodevelopmental conditions do not occur in isolation, but tend to overlap with each other. And partly this is a facet of the nature of clinical diagnosis in general, but also it's a reflection of the relative limitations of the tools we have to interrogate the brain and its function at present. In general, the view of the brain as a computer that is hardwired has become outdated. And what is important is not the physical structure, which indeed can reflect chronic changes, but rather how different interconnected networks within the brain operate. fMRI studies, which indirectly measure brain activity spatially, do actually show in distinct differences in brain activity and functional collectivity, though at present use is not routine in diagnosis because it's not seen to be beneficial in adding, because other things can cause those changes as well. Also, within the research sphere, there are cognitive tests that can be used measuring sustained attention, impulsivity, working memory, and processing speed that can support an ADHD diagnosis. Though again, routine use is mitigated by this inherent uncertainty over being able to disentangle from other causes of impaired cognitive function. It's worth considering, how does the brain actually work, if you're considering why it can go wrong. I'll do a future video where I go into this in more detail. But in essence, we can break down function of the brain into cognitive systems that work to a degree autonomously of each other, but then also interact with each other. These include perception, language, memory, concepts and thoughts, emotion, decision-making, attention, and action-taking. And there's a tentative mapping of these different areas onto of these different systems onto areas of the cortex, which is the outside bit of the brain. But in regards to attention, it's been proposed there's this threshold regulation mechanism in each cortical area, providing a neuronal basis for attention and task adjustment in form of a feedback loop that controls any given area. Overall, there's been a shift from this concept of neurons or specific areas as basic functional units, having said that, to one of activity occurring in distributed networks between areas. In essence, the brain acts as a Bayesian inferencing system that is always on. So this means that it's comparing incoming stimuli to previous experience. What we expect to see becomes refined and shapes our perception. And then that can have a knock-on effect on our behavior. Furthermore, perception also involves sensory information from internal and external stimuli, with an active process of extraction occurring at lower levels. So, for example, in the visual system, this would be at the level of the retina and the nerves as they come in and wind their way through the brain to the visual cortex. And this can be affected by learning, memory, attention, and expectation or context. These can be easily demonstrated through the use of different sensory illusions that are out there. And it's an application of what we call Gestalt principles. Of particular importance of this is the concept of affordance, which is how the quality of an object or environment relates to us. And there are thought to be two systems, one fast, looking at spatial relationships and how objects relate to each other, and one that is slower, looking at how objects relate to ourselves and their possible uses. And disruption to these, or switching between them, can partly explain the behavior patterns that we see in practice. The other concept that is useful to understand is known as Weber-Fechner bias, and this is from the observation that generally as sensory stimuli increase, there's a greater magnitude required to perceive change in a non-linear fashion. This means that the threshold for perception can and does change as it's being modulated by prior expectation and stimulus exposure. With regards to attention itself, current thinking is that we are bad at multitasking, and rather than attending to more than one thing at a time, it requires rapid switching between attention and focus. So it's probably more correct to view ADHD as not so much a lack of attention, but difficulty with controlling switching focus of attention. And this is commonly manifesting as sort of hyperfocus or distractibility. There is thought to be a cognitive load limitation, whereby greater demand on working memory impacts demand on attentional resources, and a greater disruption of effects from distractors, which are then more likely to be perceived as irritating. So taking that all together, I think it shows that disruption at any of these stages, or in how these networks interact, can manifest with differences in cognitive function. And, in other words, ADHD, autism, and neurodivergence is something that you would predict to occur by virtue of our current understanding of how the brain actually works. I think that's probably it for now, but I hope this video has helped shed some light on the underlying complexities of the situation. And please like and subscribe if you found this useful.